Why do countries borrow from institutions that destroy their economies? How can a loan be more devastating than a military invasion? What makes debt a more effective weapon than bombs? When did financial institutions replace armies as tools of domination? Why do nations surrender their sovereignty without a single shot fired? How does the International Monetary Fund control more territory than any empire in history? The answers reveal a system of control so sophisticated, so quietly brutal, that most people never recognize it as warfare. This is economic conquest, and it's happening right now. Welcome to Economics of Power. For most of history, empires expanded through military force. Armies invaded, cities burned, populations submitted or died. The costs were enormous. Soldiers needed payment. Weapons required manufacturing. Occupation demanded constant military presence. But sometime in the late 20th century, the powerful discovered something remarkable. You don't need tanks to control a nation. You don't need soldiers to extract resources. You don't need occupation to dictate policy. You just need debt. A loan becomes a leash. Interest becomes tribute. And the International Monetary Fund becomes the most effective imperial institution ever created. This is how economic warfare replaced military conquest. The system works with elegant simplicity. A developing nation faces economic crisis. Currency collapses. Reserves deplete. Default looms. The government desperately seeks help. The IMF and World Bank arrive, offering salvation through loans. The terms seem reasonable initially. Low interest rates, extended repayment schedules, technical assistance included. But buried in every loan agreement are conditions called structural adjustment programs. These aren't suggestions, they're requirements, and they fundamentally restructure the borrowing nation's entire economy to serve creditor interests. This is where debt transforms from financial instrument into weapon of control. The violence is structural, not physical, but the conquest is absolute. Structural adjustment programs follow a predictable pattern. First, privatize state-owned enterprises. Sell national resources to foreign corporations at bargain prices. Second, eliminate subsidies on food, fuel, and agriculture. Force the poor to pay market prices they cannot afford. Third, cut government spending on healthcare, education, and social services. Redirect funds toward debt repayment. Fourth, deregulate markets and remove trade barriers. Open the economy to foreign competition that destroys local industries. Fifth, liberalize capital controls. Allow foreign investors to move money freely, extracting profits without restriction. These conditions aren't designed to help the borrowing nation, they're designed to facilitate extraction. The consequences are systematic and devastating. When Mexico defaulted in 1982, it became the testing ground for structural adjustment. The IMF prescribed austerity, privatization, and trade liberalization. Mexican industry collapsed. Real wages fell 40%, poverty exploded, but foreign corporations acquired Mexican assets at fire sale prices. American banks recovered their loans with interest. The system worked perfectly for creditors. Mexico became permanently dependent on external financing. Its economy restructured to serve foreign interests. Sovereignty transferred from government to international financial institutions. This wasn't debt relief. It was conquest through compound interest. And it established the template for decades of economic subjugation. The pattern repeated across continents. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, over 70 countries underwent structural adjustment. Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, all subjected to identical policies regardless of local conditions. The Structural Adjustment Participatory Review International Network documented the results, dismantled local industries, eroded job security, privatized essential services, reduced access to healthcare and education. Countries that followed IMF prescriptions experienced deeper poverty, greater inequality, and slower growth than those that didn't, but debt levels increased. Why? Because structural adjustment wasn't designed to promote development. It was designed to ensure repayment and maintain dependency. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was structural. Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary leader, understood this perfectly. In 1987, he declared, "Each one of us becomes the financial slave," which is to say, a true slave, of those who had been treacherous enough to put money in our countries with obligations for us to repay. He refused to accept that Africans owed debts contracted by dictators to enrich themselves and foreign corporations. He called for collective debt repudiation. He was assassinated 4 months later. His replacement immediately accepted IMF loans with standard conditions. The lesson was clear. Resist debt imperialism and you'll be removed. Comply, and you can stay in power while your people suffer. John Perkins, former economic consultant, described the system's mechanics in Confessions of an Economic Hitman. His job was convincing developing countries to accept massive loans for infrastructure projects designed to fail commercially but enrich international contractors. When countries couldn't repay, they surrendered control. Oil rights, military bases, UN votes, natural resources, political alignment, debt created leverage for demands no military invasion could achieve. If economic hitmen failed, he explained, CIA-backed coups followed. If coups failed, military intervention occurred. But usually, debt worked. It was cheaper, quieter, and more effective than bombs. Economic warfare replaced physical violence. The IMF claims it reformed after the 1990s. That structural adjustment programs ended. That new approaches respect national sovereignty. The evidence contradicts this completely. Research analyzing all IMF-mandated reforms from 1980 to 2019 found virtually no change in practice. The rhetoric shifted. The conditions remained. During COVID-19, 85% of IMF pandemic loans required austerity measures once health crises abated. Countries facing their worst economic disasters in decades were forced to cut healthcare spending, eliminate fuel subsidies, and privatize state assets. The IMF leveraged desperation to impose reforms it had demanded for 40 years. Crisis became opportunity for further subjugation. Consider the numbers. As of 2025, over two-thirds of low-income nations are in or near debt distress. More than 3.4 billion people live in countries spending more on debt interest than on healthcare or education combined. That's 100 million more than last year. Emerging economies in Africa, the Caribbean, and Pacific carry $29 trillion in public debt, 30% of global public debt despite representing a fraction of global wealth. They face borrowing costs far higher than wealthy nations for identical debt levels. Credit rating agencies systematically undervalue their governance improvements and economic potential. The system is designed to keep them indebted. The debt trap functions through deliberate policy. Low-income countries face crises rooted in colonial extraction, unequal trade relationships, and global financial architecture that perpetuates dependency. When crisis hits, they have no alternatives. Domestic resources are already exhausted. International capital markets charge prohibitive rates. Only the IMF and World Bank will lend. But the loans come with conditions that prevent actual development. Countries cannot invest in education, healthcare, or infrastructure. They must prioritize debt repayment. Economic growth becomes impossible. More loans become necessary. The cycle continues indefinitely. This isn't incompetence. It's design. Perpetual debt creates perpetual control. Oxfam documented how this operated during the pandemic. The IMF forced countries to cut public spending precisely when populations needed support most. Governments couldn't provide health care during a health crisis, couldn't subsidize food during supply disruptions, couldn't protect jobs during economic collapse. All resources flowed toward creditors in wealthy nations. Meanwhile, those same wealthy nations deployed unprecedented stimulus spending without constraint. The double standard was explicit. The IMF published research proving austerity worsens poverty and inequality, then demanded austerity from poor countries while warning rich countries against it. The hypocrisy revealed the system's true purpose, not development, extraction. The geopolitical implications extend beyond economics. Debt determines foreign policy. Countries owing the IMF vote with the United States at the UN, they provide military bases, grant resource extraction rights, align diplomatically. The correlation is documented and undeniable. Sovereign nations become client states through financial dependence. This is why observers call it neo-colonialism. Colonial powers once sent governors and garrisons. Now they send loan agreements and technical advisors. The control is identical. The violence is structural rather than physical. But sovereignty disappears just as completely, and resistance carries the same consequences it did under direct colonial rule, compliance or regime change. Understanding debt as weapon clarifies seemingly irrational policies. Why do countries accept loans with conditions that guarantee failure? Because leaders who refuse face coups, assassinations, or invasion. Why do governments prioritize debt repayment over citizen welfare? Because international financial institutions can destroy their currency, collapse their economy, and terminate access to global capital. Why don't countries default collectively? Because the system isolates resistors and rewards collaborators. Game theory predicts cooperation when defection is individually punished, even if collective action would benefit all players. Debt operates as coordination problem deliberately structured to prevent unified resistance. Individual nations cannot escape. Collective action faces massive coordination barriers. Recent developments reveal the system's evolution. China's Belt and Road Initiative sparked accusations of debt trap diplomacy. Western media claimed China lures countries into unsustainable loans to seize strategic assets. Some truth exists in these claims, but the hypocrisy is staggering. The IMF and World Bank have practiced debt trap diplomacy for 70 years. Chinese loans often carry lower interest rates, fewer conditions, and more willingness to restructure or forgive debt. When Sri Lanka faced crisis in 2022, Western media blamed Chinese lending, but China owned 10% of Sri Lankan debt. The IMF, World Bank, and Western bondholders owned the rest. Projection is propaganda's oldest technique. This isn't defending Chinese lending. It's recognizing that debt as weapon isn't culturally specific. It's structurally inherent to the creditor-debtor relationship when power disparities exist. Any institution with monopoly on credit in crisis can impose conditions. The IMF dominated for decades. Now China offers alternatives. Countries choose Chinese loans precisely because IMF conditions are more destructive. When loans require no privatization, no austerity, no structural adjustment, borrowers rationally prefer them. This terrifies Western powers, not because they care about debt traps, but because their monopoly on financial coercion is ending. Competition in economic warfare threatens established imperial arrangements. The future of debt as weapon remains uncertain. As of 2025, the Global South's debt crisis reaches levels unseen since the 1980s. Climate change adds new pressures. Countries need massive investment in adaptation and mitigation. But debt service consumes resources required for survival. The contradictions intensify. Some nations default, others seek Chinese refinancing. A few attempt coordinated resistance. The Bretton Woods institutions face legitimacy crises, but their structural power remains. And powerful states won't surrender their most effective tool of control without resistance. Debt-based imperialism won't end peacefully. It will end only when debtor nations collectively refuse payment, regardless of consequences. Debt replaced war because it's more efficient. Military conquest costs money, kills soldiers, and creates resistance. Debt conquers quietly. It appears voluntary. Countries request loans, sign agreements, accept conditions. But consent under duress isn't consent. It's coercion. The violence isn't less real because it's structural. People die when healthcare budgets are cut. Children starve when food subsidies end. Economies collapse when industries are destroyed. The suffering is identical to military occupation. The control is more complete. Understanding debt as weapon doesn't tell us how to resist it, but it destroys the illusion that the current system serves development, fairness, or human welfare. It serves power, always.